Great. Hi, I'm Flora. I'm the librarian of the University of Hong Kong. I'm here to introduce Paul. Good that he's sitting down because he's so much taller than me. And someone said, reminded them of the picture with John Lee, the CEO of Hong Kong, and Yao Ming. Kind of feel like that right now. Okay, Paul French was born in London and lived and worked in Shanghai for many years. He specializes in books about modern Chinese history and contemporary Chinese society, including all the books over there: Midnight in Peking, City of Devils, Destination Shanghai, Destination Peking, just to name a few. There's many books over there. You can take a look. Paul said he uses the library collection for over 25 years to support his work. We have displayed the books here, so you can take a look later on. And there's also a book sale if you want to collect a few more with his autograph today. And Paul today selected 2 books from our collection. One is from the special collection and other one from the general collection to show us. So I'm sure my introduction doesn't do him justice, and he will further elaborate how handsome he is and his lifetime journey in China and yeah, all that. So that's great. So I have a small gift to present to Paul first, and then we will let him talk to us about the great stories.
Is it books?
No, unfortunately, it's not
okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Take a picture too with that. Just very briefly. Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you very much for coming. It's lovely to be here. I haven't been in Hong Kong, obviously, for 3 years, like everyone. So as soon as they said that the Hong Kong Literary Festival next week was going to be in person rather than, as it has been for the last couple of years, on Zooms and things, which wasn't much fun for me sitting in my kitchen in London. Zooming with Hong Kong is not as good as actually sort of being here. So, and it's nice to be back in Hong Kong University Library, which used to be a sort of home from home for me. And I lived in Shanghai for a long time, and I used to come here on business a lot to Hong Kong, and I would always try and structure business on Thursdays and Fridays or Mondays and Tuesdays so that I could have the weekend in the library. And they used to do a great scheme, I think you still do, called the Circle of Friends, which wherever you lived in the world, you could pay a very reasonable amount of money to be a member of the circle, and you could come here and use everything. Look at the special collections, use the microfilm, which I'll talk about a little bit, and the books. They just wouldn't let you borrow anything, right? Because obviously you could disappear through the airport with that. And at that time, there was a lot of stuff on the open shelves, which I'll also talk about, which is now in the special collections. And I think missed my chance to make my pension by slipping those out of the library. Funnily enough, although most of the work I've done has been about mainland China, Beijing and Shanghai particularly, and also on very different subjects, pretty much all of the books that I've done and a lot of projects that I've done over time have started here in this library. I think, as they say, every book is a journey, and they have to start with a first step, and that has to be finding something that intrigues you: a letter, a photograph, a memoir that you didn't know existed that tells you something, or newspaper article that sort of excites you in some way. And then what happens is usually frustrating. It just ends up being a dead end. You can't find enough information, and it just becomes a blog post, or nowadays, not then, nowadays it would become an Instagram picture or something, and it doesn't go any further, but it's sort of an interesting historical fact. Sometimes it makes it. I still write a lot for the Shanghai Morning Post weekend magazine, and sometimes it will make a kind of 2,500 to 3,000 word piece for a magazine, and sometimes it becomes a whole kind of 100,000 word 350 page book with footnotes. Although, as one of my editors from Hong Kong University Press is here, he'll know that I'm not really very good at footnotes, but they sort of annoy me in books, and I kind of try and get on with the story. And whether it's going to be a blog post or up on the gram, or is going to become a book, tends to depend on places like this. It depends on libraries, on archives. It depends on time in the stacks, times digging around, looking for hours at microfilm, which you still have a lot of microfilm here. And even though they've improved the machine, if you've ever used microfilm, you'll know that it's a very frustrating system trying to spool it all on there. And I even after years, I never got very good at that. I'd always, you know, everything would be the wrong way around when I gave it back, and I'd just sort of run away quickly and leave that problem for the librarian. I apologize for that. I was going to talk about a few of the different projects I've done and how they started in the library, and also what I sort of found here in the library. The first reason I wanted to come to the library here was I was doing a biography of Karl Crowe, which is over there, and Karl Crowe's sort of quite well known now, and I think that's largely down to all the stuff I've written about him over the years. But he was reasonably famous in that he came to China in 1911 as a journalist from Missouri, United States. And Missouri University had a very good journalism program, still does have a very good journalism program. And it had an arrangement with China for many Chinese students to come at that time to be trained as journalists. So they went back, and obviously a lot of people, if someone's CV came into work for one of the newspapers in Shanghai or somewhere else, and it had University of Missouri, there was often a Chinese or another foreign Missouri alumni that would sort of hire each other. So that's why we have so many, you know, when you look at the history of foreigners in China, particularly in the media, you'll see so many people from Missouri, or at least that went to that university, because there was this great link with China. And in fact, they still have I went there some years ago to put Karl Crowe into the Journalism Hall of Fame for Missouri, which is an odd sort of institution. But anyway, he was entered into it. It's mostly sort of people who write about baseball and things like that. He was the first sort of person who'd worked abroad. And they still had, as we were walking into the building that is still the Department of Journalism, behind these kind of bushes that had grown over the years, there were these two food dogs, you know, the traditional Chinese statues, food dogs. And I said, oh, look, you've still got the food dogs. And the guy from Missouri University just sort of looked at me and said, what are you talking about, right? He's like, the lions, you mean? And I'm like, no, they're not lions. And they were given to the university by Karl Crowe and other foreign alumni who had gone to Shanghai back in the 1920s. And they had been, you can see original photos of them on each side of the entranceway, recognizing this relationship with China. And over the years, the bushes had grown over them. Everyone had forgotten when they arrived who gave them to the university and why they were there. And I'm pleased to say they've now cut back the bushes and sort of cleaned them up a little bit. They were a little bit covered in bird poo. And they sort of cleaned them all up, and they're there now with a little plaque if you ever go to Missouri University. Anyway, he came in 1911 to be a journalist, and it was a good time to come, because a month after coming to China and landing in Shanghai, not ever been to China before, not even having thought about China before, of course, the Xinhai Revolution breaks out in Hankow, and he is dispatched to report on it. And this, I think, is one of the things that certainly doesn't begin, but is one of the great instances in foreign media portrayals of China, of someone with pretty much no knowledge of China, pretty much zero knowledge of Chinese, or at that time it would have been Shanghainese, that he would have had to have learned, going somewhere and reporting very authoritatively on what is happening. That the Qing dynasty, the 267-year-old Qing dynasty, is collapsing, and I'm going to tell you why. I've been here 3 weeks. This is what's happening. But that's the job he was given and he had to do. He stayed in journalism for a while, founding an American English language newspaper. North China Daily News was the British newspaper. It was very much the voice of London, the voice of Whitehall in China. And the Americans decided that they would have a newspaper called the China Press. It is very hard to find complete runs of the China Press, which began in 1911 all the way through, but they have it here. And they have it here on microfiche, which was better for me because they have a complete run in Shanghai at the HKU Library, which is part of Shanghai Library, but it's housed in the old Jesuit mission at the Foochow Cathedral. And they have not digitized it. So they only have the originals. And although I think they've improved their regime back then, not that long ago, but quite a long time in Chinese years, if you like, it was still a paper copy that was kept not in quite so air-conditioned and temperature-controlled premises as these. You didn't have to wear gloves. There was no control on who was taking pens and pencils in. People were folding over the corners of newspapers to go back and look at things later. I mean, it was a mess. And I really didn't want to use those. Plus, of course, on the microfilm here, you can sprawl through and then just wallop a button and off it prints, or save it as a PDF, take it away and look at it later. So a complete run. So I could see his first journalism, his first bylines in the newspapers in China, right through to when he left and set up China's first Western style advertising agency, which was really what I wanted to write about. And that was useful as well, because then I came back. He had a little company logo, which was a sort of a junk, traditional junk boat. And so I could go to all the advertising in all of the newspapers. And he did two things. One was he took Western companies like Kodak or Colgate or someone like that, and he advertised them in China to the Chinese, in the Chinese newspapers. And the other was, of course, he was in the newspapers targeting the foreigners in Shanghai and so on. He was advertising, companies that had brought in whiskey or wine or new cars, Buicks or Cadillacs or something, and all of this. But his adverts always had the little junk boat logo, so I could identify who his clients were and who he was working for and where he was advertising. Of course, they would have their advertising rates, and that helped the business history job of trying to work out how much money he was making. Another book that I did, which I'm glad that Michael Duckworth is here, and it was a long and involved process, was the old Shanghai A to Z. Now, an A to Z is, I had to explain to Michael what an A to Z was at the time, but I didn't realize that it wasn't a global phenomenon. The London A to Z is this famous book, which is now an app, of course, of every street in London, right? So if if you want to find a street, you use this A to Z, right? From Adelaide Avenue to Zebra Street, or I don't know what the Z would be in London, but anyway. And I wanted to do that for Shanghai because, of course, all the road names in Shanghai have been changed. So they were all originally in the international settlement, usually British names, named after supposedly important British people or people who had been in business in China. Plus, around parts of the old town of Shanghai, if you know, then of course it would have various names of Chinese names, but some of these would get changed over time as people sort of fell out of favor and in favor. And then, of course, the French concession had its own series of names. And even these changed over time. After the First World War, for instance, many roads were renamed after French Shanghai landers, foreigners living in Shanghai who had died in the First World War. And then later on, they were changed again. And then we went through a process where Chiang Kai-shek started changing some of the road names when he had power. And then actually during the war, Wang Jingwei decided to change some of the names that he felt were anti-Japanese or anti-German, when he was the sort of traitor leader of China. And then some more changed after the war when Chiang Kai-shek came back for a few years. And then, of course, everything changed after 1949. So all the road names are changed now. To what you know. So I wanted to do an A to Z, which was all the old names and all the new names, because everyone who was doing research was annoying me, because this was the time when everyone was writing family histories and then self-publishing them on Amazon for whatever. And they were annoying the hell out of me because they were sending me emails all the time. I don't get so many now, saying, my grandmother lived on Carter Road, number 14 Carter Road. Where's that? So I'd say, okay, now it is like called, Runmin Street or something, and number 14 has been bulldozed and is now a shopping mall or something. Right? Sorry. But here's a photo, maybe if I had a photo of it. Once I published that book, it was the unique marketing strategy that every annoying, lazy researcher in the world that was doing Shanghai history would send me a thing saying, my grandmother lived on, Mohawk Street in the international settlement. What's that now? And I'd say, now there's a book you can buy from the great University Press of Hong Kong that will tell you that information. Plus, it'll have lots of adverts for shops that were on that street. So I tried to identify where the churches were, where the shops were, where the department stores were, where big businesses were, so that people could track it down, and also so that I would be quite interested in it. And again, that all came mostly from newspapers. Searching here on newspapers, you go through the adverts. There's an advert for, I don't know, Wing On department store, or Sun Sun, or the great sort of Nanjing Road stores or something, or one of the churches, it'll be the Catholic Church with services at 7 a.m., 11 a.m., 4 p.m. or something. And you could just hit the button, and there it was. Nice, high resolution image for me to give to Michael, who always wants, of course, high resolution images. And, you know, it could all be designed up and do very well. So then I came to do Midnight in Peking, which really was a book that has done, well, ridiculously well, actually. I mean, better than it should, probably. But it has done very well, and it's gone through lots of printings, and it's still quite popular. And the thing about that book was I was looking purposefully for an idea. I was writing the book on Karl Crowe, the A to Z. I did another one on the history of foreign journalists, which, of course, I was able to look at all their information here in the brilliant newspaper archives. The newspaper archives here on microfilm, by the way, have all of the English language newspapers that used to exist in China, particularly in Shanghai, but also in Beijing, also in Tianjin, and elsewhere. But they also have several of the newspapers that were done in French and German for those communities. And they have not complete runs, but very interesting ones. There were newspapers, or at least monthly magazines, for Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers. There's several issues of one that was done for Yiddish speakers, for the Jewish refugees that came to Shanghai in World War II, which is a story I'm sure you know. And they're all there, and they're really useful as well. Plus, there are, of course, all of the Chinese language newspapers from Shanghai and elsewhere, who would often translate what the foreigners were writing about Shanghai, either because it was quite useful for them to do that, because they agreed with what the foreigners said, but the foreigners couldn't be the worst that could happen to a foreigner was they could just be thrown out. And if they're in Shanghai, they couldn't do anything to them. But if there was a Chinese name to it, then that person could be subject to persecution or trouble, prison from the nationalist regime at the time. So they would often just translate what foreigners had written, or get foreigners to write things, translate it, and then put it in there as a safe way of being able to publish information. And I've been looking through a newspaper, and I came across a story that I was interested in. And what I was looking for was a story whereby I could tell some of China's history, but do it in such a way that everybody in the world would want to read the book, right? Because the number of people who want to read Chinese history, which is very complicated, right? Republican era Chinese history, warlords, there's this warlord, that warlord, this warlord, that leader. The names are difficult. Everyone has trouble with them. And, but I wanted a story that people would really want, and they would get a kind of hidden history lesson, a secret history lesson. So the book would be so good that they wouldn't realize that they'd learned a lot about Chinese history. They'd just think they read something. And I thought the best way to do that is to take the market for books on China, which is about that big, and the market for something else, like, say, true crime, which is that big. And if you put that with that, that's how you get on the New York Times bestseller list, right? Because you combine those two things. And I was looking for something. I thought this is going to be quite difficult. And I found that there was an English girl, 19 years old, who had been murdered in Beijing, 1937, January 1937, and no one had ever been caught for the murder. So I thought, oh, that's quite interesting, right? Unsolved murders. This was just at the time when everyone was starting to do podcasts, and Netflix was starting to do their first true crime was becoming this enormous market, and in any bookshop in the world, pretty much crime in general is the biggest genre of sales. So I thought this is a good story. And then I read in the newspaper, which I couldn't believe when I heard it, that a detective from Scotland Yard in London, like the most famous sort of police department in the world, was in Tianjin at the time and was asked to come to Beijing to look into this murder. And he worked with the head of the Peking at the time, Beijing Detective Bureau, Inspector Han Shiqing, who was known as the Sherlock Holmes of China. And I thought, well, Sherlock Holmes of China, and like this Chinese guy and this English guy, both of them policemen, right? Both coppers working together. This has got to be interesting. And as far as I know to this day, only ever happened once, right? And I thought, this is a great story of, British-Chinese collaboration and what happens when foreigners and Chinese work together to do something. Of course, they didn't solve the murder, so it's not actually a great example of what happens if you get together, but it wasn't really their fault. And then I read that she was the daughter of a famous British consul, diplomat, and also that though the Chinese detective and the British detective worked quite hard to try and solve the murder, and there were lots of suspects, and it was assumed to come from within the foreign community, and that the British had put influence on the British detectives, which was basically quite blatant. Find a Chinese guy, blame a Chinese guy. This cannot have been a white person killed by a white person. That we cannot have that. We would lose so much face in front of the Chinese that we can't have that. The problem was that it clearly was a white person who had done it. I'm not going to tell you who did it, obviously, but that was the story. And then I thought, all of this is interesting. All of this is really good. Maybe it can go somewhere. It's quite fun. And there is a whole story about a cache of archive documents that I found in London, actually, in this case, that I think explained who did it. But the really important thing was that when that went from an idea for an interesting story, maybe a magazine piece or maybe just a long blog post or something, to an actual book, was when I came here and I was going through the newspapers, and here they have the North China Daily News, which was the big British newspaper in Shanghai. And I went through it. And of course, for the day that she was killed, or the day after she was killed, there on the front page of the newspaper was a photograph of her. And I think, when you're doing true crime, that ability to have, actually, we haven't got an edition with the picture on the front. Most publishers decided to put the picture on the front. But, that moment that you see the picture of someone who's dead, it then becomes something much, much more than just reading a crime novel, right? Or watching another cop show on TV or something, right? It becomes something very real. That person becomes very real. And that was when I realized that I was going to be able to get enough, and I was going to be able to personalize it, so that once you see the picture of the girl that died, you won't be able to get it out of your head. You'll think about it all the time. And that's when it becomes one of these compulsive true crime stories. But the interesting thing for this library as well was, apart from that, was that E.T.C. Werner, Edward Werner, who was the diplomat, he had adopted this girl, and he had been a British consul all over the place. He spoke 7 Chinese dialects. He also spoke French, English, German. His father had been German, Portuguese, because he'd been in Macau for a while. And of course, being well-educated and posh, he spoke Latin and Greek as well, right? So I defy anyone to be better at languages than this guy, because of course that's the trick that I didn't have to go through, which is, I could just wander off to university and do Putonghua with simplified characters, and they gave you a degree for that, believe it or not. And you were just like, well, that wasn't as difficult as I thought it was going to be. But in those days, of course, you had to learn the dialects, right? There was no national language. There was no Putonghua. So if you were stationed in Shanghai, you had to learn Shanghainese. If you were stationed in Beijing, you had to learn Pekingese, which is not quite the same as what we now call Putonghua. And many, many much smaller dialects as well. Much smaller than the big sort of Shanghainese, Cantonese, and some of the big ones. So, that's quite a phenomenal achievement to start with. But he also was a great China scholar. Now, normally when British diplomats retire, they go back to England and they get a house in the countryside somewhere, and they just sit around in the pub, boring everyone with stories of when they were in China that nobody, of course, back in England is remotely interested in. But Edward Werner didn't. He stayed in China and worked on various bits and pieces of scholarship. And his wife had died. She died not long after they had adopted Pamela. And so he raised her alone. And he was really a very cold English father. And partly the book is about how this cold English father loses his daughter and comes to, well, in the end, break his health, lose all his money, and eventually stay in China far too long. He was one of the last English people left in China in the 1950s, in the search for the killer of his daughter. So he goes from very cold to very sort of lovable and admirable in the end. And he dies knowing that no justice was ever done for his daughter's killers. Anyway, I was browsing on the shelves here. The system that you use here now. I don't know what you call it. It used to be called Dragon, but it's a very good search engine. They use it in libraries all over the world. And I put his name in and this book came up, and I'd never come across this book anywhere before. And it's published by a small publisher in China at the time. It was published in 1927, 10 years before his daughter's murder. And it is a collection of very strange articles. For instance, he argues against decimalization. So if you have any idea about how English money used to work, right, when it was what, 12 pence or 12.5 pence to the pound, I mean, you had to be, it was mathematically contortionist to try and work out how much was a pound, right? It was, and a shilling and a tanner. It was just bonkers, right? And of course, then we moved to the decimalization system in the 70s, like everyone else in the world, right? So, you know, 10 is 100, and you know, 100, 10 hundreds are 1,000, and it all sort of makes sense. But he writes this whole essay saying why we shouldn't have decimalization. He sort of sees it almost as a sort of a, you know, very early form of Brexit, that we should sort of hold on to this ridiculous money system that we've got, currency system, rather than go over to this sort of decimalization system, which is of course being used by the perfidious, nasty French, and also by, you know, this bunch of anti-monarchist Republicans in the United States with their dollars, their jumped up dollars and all the rest of it. And we shouldn't be doing this. So he writes it, and then he does a sort of an autobiography of his life, and it's absolutely fascinating. It really is. It told me so much about him that I couldn't possibly have known. He's also an expert in legends of China and traditions of China. So he has a long chapter in there on the Chinese funerals, how to understand when you see a Chinese funeral, mourning rites and things like that. That are still very, very useful. And this book, I have to say, this book is amazing. It probably would not interest anyone here except me, but and I've sort of synthesized what's important for you in my book. But the thing about it was, when I found it, this is a second copy that I didn't know existed until today. There was a ex libris, you know, a sheet in the front that had been stuck in the front saying HKU Club. HKU now part of Wuhan. And HKU was a treaty port where the foreigners were. And the HKU Club was really the British club. You know, so you know this thing about wherever the British went in the world, the first thing they did was set up a club. The second thing they did was set up a race course. Third thing they did was get drunk. So that's basically how the British sort of conquered the world, which, I mean, you know, it still amazes me that ever happened. But they set up this club, and they built a library over the years at the HKU Club, a phenomenal library that members could then take books out, mostly in English. And on every subject you could imagine: Chinese trees, Chinese flowers, Mongolian horses, which is, Mongolian ponies, a history. There's actually one book, I think, in the collection. I should have ordered it up because it's so bizarre. The history of shells in China. Like, who knew shells are really that different in China to anywhere else? But it's a history of Chinese shells, which is, yeah, and a lot of politics books about the time. And of course, a lot of politics is going on at that time in the 1920s and so on. And all sorts of other, you know, some missionary stuff, which is always a bit dreary, and some diplomat memoirs, which are, you know, slightly more interesting than the missionaries, but not very much. And some businessman memoirs, well, you'll know Hong Kong University Press does a few, just a pompous self-promotion, really, business memoirs. And so they have all of these books. And they were all over the library. This is about 2010 when I'm looking at it, and they're all over the library. So they come to Hong Kong in 1932, which I'll talk about in a minute, from China. And obviously at that time, they had made a decision. Do we keep it all together as a collection, or do we put it where people will want to find it? So if it was a book about Chinese rose growing, it went into flowers, right, on that shelf. And if it was a book about Chinese economics, it went into the economics section. And so these books went all over the library. And I came across 2 or 3 of them randomly. And they all had the same ex libris in them. And I said to the librarian at the time, was Anthony Ferguson? Was it Anthony, wasn't it? Yeah, a great librarian. I said to him, you know, this is kind of mad that you've got this collection, but it's split all over the place. And he managed to find a handwritten, actually it wasn't handwritten, it was typed on a typewriter, list of everything that had been sent from HKU to Hong Kong in 1932, and it was in a file somewhere. And he got some of the excellent librarians here to go around and find all these books, take them off the shelf, put them all together as a collection of the HKU Club, and put them in special collections under lock and key so that none of you can get your dirty little fingers on these very rare, important books. And that's where they are now, to the point that I can't even show them to you. They're so under lock and key. But that is a really good thing, because if you want to find them, you can find them on the catalogue and then ask to see them, obviously. They're accessible, but we don't want you taking them home or anything like that. But the thing about this one, Autumn Leaves, is this book is one of the great, I think, works of China by a foreigner, and a biography, and really very important. There are 2 copies in this library. One is under lock and key. It only ever was printed once. So they're both 1927. They're both published by Kelly and Walsh, which was the great Shanghai publisher, of which there is a tenuous relationship to the bookshop here. But they're both published by Kelly and Walsh in 1927. It never went into a second edition. So they're all first editions by default. And I have never found another one until today, when they said to me, you can't show the one that's in special collections. And I looked back on the thing and I saw there was 2, and there was one on open shelf, which is this one. And I thought, wow, that's incredible. And then when I saw it, I thought, oh, it's been rebound. But it hasn't been rebound, because the original cover, and you can see E.T.C. Werner's Chinese name and so on there, and Autumn Leaves is still on the inside, very well protected. That's 1927, which shows you how well a book can be preserved if it's preserved under the right conditions, and is so obscure that no one ever takes it off the shelf. But it has no real damage. I imagine that some of the speckling and spotting on it was probably how it came from HKU. It hasn't had any insect damage or anything else that drives librarians mad. And it's fantastic. Now, I have, for 15 years, had a search out for a copy of this book, right, on these online systems that allow you to search and set up alerts for every secondhand bookshop in the world, Australia, America, all across Europe, every dealer that's out there. And also the auction houses. There's a thing called Easy Live, which is a fantastic way of trying to get books. It has every auction that's going on around the world. And when something comes up for auction, you can put in all these search terms. And I have never been able to get a copy of this book. I do not own a copy of this book. I've never been able to find one. I do not know of another one anywhere. The only places, if there was one that it could be, would be the HKU Library in Shanghai. They don't have one. National Library in Beijing doesn't have one. The British Library does not have one, because although it's by a Brit, and they should have every book ever written by a Brit, it was published in China. So it didn't fall under the remit of having to have a copy in the British Library, and it's not there. And even in large collections that have been built up over the years, like where I spend a lot of time in the London Library, which is a private library, they don't have copies of it. And often they would have copies of things like that. So I'm sort of really quite jealous that that's there. I was thinking maybe I could swap you. You know, would you take like a Shanghai A to Z for, no, okay. Also, E.T.C. Werner had rung a bell in my head when I was researching him. Because when I did Chinese in the 1980s, one of the courses that we did was, of course, traditions and histories of China. And the book that we were given was this fat tome called A Dictionary of Chinese Mythology, which is by Edward Werner. Now, this has been reprinted many, many, many times. It was written originally for the Royal Asiatic Society of China, North China branch, which was actually the Shanghai branch, not the Royal Asiatic Society in Beijing always called itself the Royal Asiatic Society, Peking, and the North China branch was Shanghai, because it was founded slightly after the Hong Kong branch, which is, of course, the Hong Kong branch, but Shanghai is north of Hong Kong. And of course, now all three both exist again. The 2 in China have been restarted. Interestingly, though, this book, which is a history of every, with all the Chinese characters you need as well, a history of every legend, tradition, ghosts, zombies, every kind of fantastical creatures, everything that's ever been recorded in Chinese history, going all the way back. And Werner, with his linguistic skills and also his research skills, put this together in 1922. This has a 1932 binding on it, but it's a 1922 book. And to this day, although there are much cheaper editions you can get now that have been reprinted in Taiwan and Singapore and things, it is still the set text. No one's ever bettered this book on legends and that. And there is a link between that, because one of the rumors when Pamela was murdered was that she was a fox spirit, Hu Li Jing, and that she had been killed because she was a fox spirit. And I wanted to put this in the book, even though, of course, the detectives never investigated this. It was a rumor that went around at the time. It showed the level of superstition in China. And of course, the person who wrote more about fox spirit traditions in China than anyone else at that time and since, really, although there have been a couple of books on fox spirits, was Werner in this book. And that then became a rumor about his own daughter's death, that there is so much on fox spirits in this book. But the link, of course, is just that fox spirits are a massive tradition in Chinese mythology. So those kind of things exist in this library. Have I got anything else to talk about? Not really. I would say at the moment, I'm going to give a plug for a book I'm working on at the moment. I'm working on a book at the moment, which I'm just sort of about to finish. It'll be out next year, on Wallis Simpson and the year that she spent in China. I don't know if you know who Wallis Simpson is, but she was, of course, the American divorcee who came to London eventually, and the Prince of Wales, who then became the king, fell in love with her, and there was this enormous argument about whether or not a member of the royal family of Britain could marry a divorced American. Now, this may sound familiar because we're sort of going through this process very cathartically and in difficult circumstances again in Britain at the moment. Although Wallis was twice divorced. Anyway, so as you know, it led to the abdication, right, with the king deciding to step down as king. So however you see Wallis Simpson, it's either the greatest love story in history, that someone would give up the crown for you, or she's the most awful person in history, which again, this may sound familiar to you about Meghan now. You know, she has her supporters and she has her detractors. Anyway, and of course, the British media disgraced itself entirely over Wallis Simpson, as it is disgracing itself entirely over Meghan Markle. But the thing about Wallis Simpson, if you think about her, of course, is that she had a very Asian chinoiserie style all her life. She always wore cheongsams. They may have been made in Paris, but they were sort of cheongsam style. She wore a lot of Chinese knotwork. She kept her hair in a jet black chignon sort of style, which was reminiscent of late Manchu, early Republican styles. And also by looking at photographs of her houses over the years, both in America and then when she came to London with several houses. And then, of course, later after the abdication, when she was the Duchess of Windsor with the Duke of Windsor, when they had a house in the Bois de Boulogne in Paris when they were in exile, you can see all the way through on the coffee table a collection of small jade Chinese elephants and Chinese screens and some lacquerware boxes. And, you know, in the archives in America, actually, uncovered the actual sales receipts for some of these from curio and China dealers in China, in Beijing, that were actually on Jade Street and the curio markets there. And some she bought later. And they followed her around. She spent 1924, she came to Hong Kong, where her husband was stationed with the US Navy. She went briefly to Canton. Her husband then, as you may know, beat her up very badly and she tried to divorce him. So she went to Shanghai thinking she could get a divorce. She spent some time in Shanghai. And then she went to Beijing, where she develops this sense of aesthetics and appreciation for China. And she leaves in 1925, but she never loses this. And also when she's in Beijing, she's mixing in, she's just a girl from Baltimore. She goes to Beijing and then a US Navy wife. And then when she goes to Beijing, she's mixing with this international set of people. You know, diplomats and the sort of foreign community of Beijing. And that really lifts her up as this confident, strong, not really intellectual, but quite able to hold a conversation person, and actually very knowledgeable on jade and many things about China, which later on she was so rich that she could just get Cartier and people like that to sort of recreate it. She didn't need to buy the Chinese stuff anymore. And I think it's a kind of origin story of her. And again, you know, that story is going back to the archives again here in Hong Kong, being able to find out where the US Navy had their houses, where they stayed when they were here. And again, libraries in Shanghai and Beijing. So everything always goes back, even though you find a story that is sort of exciting and thrilling and it's someone that you know. And again, it's my kind of policy of, you know, the market for China books is that, the market for books on the royal family is, put the two together and hopefully, you know, I can get a new kitchen or something the year after next. So that's kind of what I think is important. But I don't know what else I can talk about, really. I've talked about how great your microfilm collection is. I've talked about how great your special collection is. And by the way, the reason I think it came here in 1932, there's no reason why it should come, that they should have sent it here in 1932. And although there is a paper about the collection and what's interesting, it doesn't mention why. Why would HKU British Club move everything here in 1932? Because when I first came across that collection, I thought, must have come in 1949. Someone who was getting out, put it all in boxes and came down here. Or maybe it came in 1937 to 41 to save it from the Japanese, right? But neither of those is true. It came in 1932. But I think, of course, the best answer would be that in 1932, the Japanese invaded, created a situation in Shanghai. And one of the terrible things that happened in 1932 was that the commercial press, which was actually the biggest publisher of books in Shanghai, but particularly textbooks and so on, had an incredible library in a building in the Hongkou district of Shanghai that had like Tang Dynasty manuscripts, that had Ming Dynasty texts, that had scrolls that went, you know, so far back, stuff that had also been moved from Dunhuang down to be studied in Shanghai. And the Japanese bombed it, and the entire thing was destroyed. It is like one of the biggest examples of the destruction of a library, apart from the Great Library of Alexandria, if you sort of believe that. It is like the worst example of a complete destruction of a library, and large, important amounts of Chinese culture just went up in smoke that day. And I think that the British community and everyone in places like HKU worried that what of course would happen in 1937 was going to happen in 1932, and that the Chinese would not stop at Shanghai. They would roll up the Yangtze and take over everywhere, as they did in 1937. And so they crated up the books, and they sent them to Hong Kong. And then of course things maybe calmed down a little bit afterwards. HKU also was becoming less important as a treaty port. But I think afterwards, you know, you can't sort of say, oh, by the way, everything's okay now, can we have our books back? Right? I mean, that would have been a bit cheeky. So they kind of sent their collection down. Anyway, so when you're in the library here, please, you know, look around and see what you find, because I've been incredibly fortunate here in what I've managed to find, and it's actually turned into like some quite interesting and occasionally profitable books, and given me a sort of a job. So I thank Hong Kong University Library very much for that. And I hope that you guys can get out on the shelves and find your own brilliant stories, because there are a million stories on those shelves out there that all need to be told. And there's a gentleman here can publish them for this university's very excellent press as well. So thank you very much. Sure.
Maybe get another.
Yes, no.
We're gonna take some question, a couple minutes.
Yeah, yeah. Sure.
Anybody has question? Oh, you're sitting on the front row here.
Yeah, the ones on the front row.
Excellent. Very fascinating. I can see you really love finding obscure books. But when you're writing about crime and the main sources are perhaps court reports, if you've got detailed court reports and the press reaction, how do you try and sort of test the truthfulness of these kind of semi-official and second-hand reporting sources? You sort of imply that you find some kind of innovative alternative ways into finding truths beyond those official sources.
Well, not really. I think it's just a combination of everything you can find. So of course the newspapers are a great way into a story, and hopefully if it was reported by any number of newspapers, and because Pamela was English, that story got into every newspaper around the world, at least for a few days. And also, it was also a story that was reported widely by the Chinese press, because it was 1937. So it wasn't by that time a question of, is Japan going to invade China? It wasn't is, it was when. Right? Everybody knew it was coming, and they knew it was going to be horrible. And when Pamela, one of the most privileged women in Beijing, her father was a senior British diplomat. They have loads of money. They live in a beautiful courtyard hutong property, right? She's at school in Tianjin, the Tianjin Grammar School. She comes back every so often. She is about to go off to Cambridge University, which would be her first trip to England actually in her life. So her whole life is about to open up. She's extremely fortunate. And it was a particularly horrible murder as well. And there was a feeling among many of the Chinese community that if one of the most privileged foreign women in Beijing could be taken away in the night and killed, and no one could find who killed them, what chance is there for the rest of us, right? What chance is there for the Lao Baixing if the privileged, protected foreigner is taken away and killed? So it was a very big story for the Chinese media as well. So you've got those two things. You've then got the official reports that are coming from the embassy. Well, at that time it was a consulate because the embassy was in Nanjing, but the consulate. And they're all going back to London. And of course, they're all kept in London. The autopsy on the body was done at the Peking Union Medical Center, which is still there in Beijing. And of course, those records have survived. So you can see the detailed autopsy records done by the doctors at PUMC. The newspapers, and also there are Americans involved in this. So the American consulate is also sending things back to Washington, which are in the National Archives. It was a unique case because of the Chinese and the British detective, but the really important thing about that case was that every note and report that the detectives did, because they were from two nations, were done in English and were done in Chinese. Now, we've never been able to find the Chinese records. Don't know what happened to those. I mean, could have been the war, could have been later, could just be sitting somewhere and we don't know where they are. But the British ones, of course, were all just packed up and sent back, and they're all at the National Archive of Kew because they were sent to the Foreign Office, their government papers, and so that's where they went. So you have that, which is quite unique, right? I mean, there's a lot of interesting murder cases and things in China, but we just don't have those records. And if they exist, I don't know where they are, and I don't think they do exist. On top of that, this was I was researching the book in sort of 2010 from about 2009, and I did manage to speak with, at that time, about 7 or 8 people who had been at school with Pamela. Now, that was really important because although they couldn't really tell me who did it, they were able to tell me, well, there was all this rumor going on. I heard my mum and dad talking about it at the dinner table. We all gossiped about it at school, because obviously if someone at your school gets killed, it's going to be what everyone's talking about, right? And that kind of thing was going on. Now, I think only one of those people is still alive, but they were able to give me interviews, which was quite useful. And I also managed to track down the family of the British detective, and that was like one of these, that was his, the one who got away story, right? So like every detective has the one who got away story, the case they never solved, right? It's like a staple on television, isn't it? And in films, they've all got the murder that they never solved that's stuck in their head. And because she was a 19-year-old girl, it was, arguably particularly horrible that someone on the cusp of life is about to do that. So all of those things together, I think, it sort of becomes something where you can sort of try to find the truth. But yeah, I mean, it's very, very difficult. You've got to balance it all up. You've got to do a similar job to the detectives, really, I suppose, and try and weigh up what's believable and what's not, what is quoted verbatim from a doctor or a policeman. And look at that. And also the interesting gossip that was around, which people always said, so-and-so did it, other people did it, Fox Spirits did it. A lot of it was gossip, but seems to be true because there was some indication in the files that the person who was the consul at the time in Beijing said it's got to be a Chinese person, right? Which is a sort of misdirection and basically corruption of the legal system, right? Now, we only have gossip that was said. They didn't put that down on paper, except after the case, that person was demoted and their career was effectively over. And there are notes in the archives to say this consul is not fit and he should never be allowed, certainly in charge of because consuls had a legal role as well, in charge of anything involving a young woman again, because there had been a murder of a French woman by a British soldier in Beijing, and he had not been particularly politically correct about that either. So, you know, you can infer from that. In the book, I put all the sources in there, a lot of them of which refer back to the microfilms here. So anyone who wants to trace it all, if you know, and nowadays, actually, you can just call up the documents from National Archives in UK. You can walk in here and look at it all on microfiche. You can sort of retrace my steps, and people have. I mean, you know, I've got the people with the alternative theories out there, you know. So, yeah.
Here you go.
You mentioned some resources, including the thing called Dragon that connects the global libraries together. And another thing you said that you can find any updates of the second-hand market.
Yeah.
What is the name of that and how do you access it?
Oh, well, I'm trying to think what there's several that do second-hand books. I mean, the most obvious one is like the dealers like Abe, you know, ABE and people like that. I mean, you can set up alerts with them and they'll pretty much pick up stuff. There's several in the United States and a couple in the UK and one in Australia that's very useful. And you just set up alerts and you forget about them. And then one day something pings into your inbox. The one that I've found has been giving me more than the book dealers actually lately has been easyliveauction.com, which is a record of every auction that's going on all over the place. And you can set up alerts on names of artists or writers or whatever, and things will ping in. And I found that very useful, particularly for paintings and things like that, but occasionally books. Of course, it's possible people put a box of books in the auctions and they don't, and they just sort of say, all of these for £100, and you know, they don't tell you what's in them and it's pot luck. So you could be missing things, but it's a fairly good indication of what's out there. And this book never comes up in it, but even really obscure Beijing artists, I mean, foreigners who were painting the Forbidden City in the 1930s, who weren't professional artists. I mean, even those occasionally come up for auction. You know, I have like a garage full of really bad art by bored housewives in 1930s Beijing, which occasionally becomes an article in the SCMP when there's enough pretty ones, and I sort of get a bit of my money back. But yeah, if anyone wants a not very good picture of the Forbidden City with a camel walking across in front of it, I've got a few of them in my garage. Yeah, I mean, you know, there are ways to find things. Dragon is what they used to call the catalog here, but the catalog system that you have here, which I don't know what the technical name of it is.
And HKUL.
Yeah, but you know, the actual software system that does it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, lots and lots of libraries around the world use that. So it's a very good, that's a very good system in terms of telling you where you are. And I mean, obviously the interlibrary loan system, I'm sure you're all part of that, you know, whereby, I mean, you can, if it's in, I don't know, the University of Westminster or something, you can sort of arrange for things to happen. And of course, so much now is being scanned online, and some good friends of mine who are Shanghai historians and everything, they will take, I mean, one thing I didn't talk about was things that they don't have here though, but things like shopping directories, which are directories of every shop in Shanghai with adverts. And if you want to know, you know, where was a certain shop, you can do it. Some people who have got the time and are very, very collegial have scanned those in. And if you go to kind of Gutenberg and some of the other systems, you'll see all of them. I noticed the other day, the University of Hawaii library has just scanned in all 50 editions of something called 20th Century magazine, which was a fascinating magazine in English, published in Shanghai during the Second World War and funded by the Nazi Party to present in English the Nazi view of the world to educated Chinese, Shanghailanders, always, you know, Shanghainese always wanting to read English and so on, and to the foreigners that were still there. And of course, fascinatingly in that, I must write a paper just to have loads of people in Hong Kong and elsewhere hate me. But it's also the first place that Zhang Eileen Chang, published film reviews and a really fascinating article on wartime fashions in Shanghai. And it's the first paper, you know, of course, her first husband was part of Wang Jingwei's puppet government, pro-Japanese government. And there she is in print in this obscure magazine funded from Berlin by the Nazis. And that was the first place that she was ever published. And I know that there's a lot of great love for Zhang Ailing out there, and I also enjoy reading her very, very much. So I'm slightly worried that if I say Zhang Ailing was financed by the Nazis, I might get half of you know, Chinese America coming after me with shotguns. But I mean, it's fascinating, and they've scanned all of those in and put them up, and you can just get them online. You can download all of it. The other thing you have here, of course, I should mention, if you're interested in Shanghai, is they have all of the Shanghai Municipal Council reports, which is the annual report for you know, for what was going on in Shanghai in any year, and it's full of fascinating things. How many people were put in prison? How many rickshaw licenses were given out? How many meters of drainage they built and things like that. It's fascinating. And there's one story there that I'm absolutely fascinated by, which is in the early years of the Shanghai Municipal Council, they have arrivals of new foreigners when there wasn't many there. And it will say 50 people arrived and have stayed from the United Kingdom, and 38 from France, and 23 from the from Portugal or wherever, right? And then at the end, they have a category: returned from transportation. And it's people who, you know, in the old days, the English was, well, we get the Irish rebels or Irish freedom fighters, just we'll go for both sides of the argument, right? And any sort of criminals, and they sent them to Australia, right? They sent them on a boat to Australia, and they weren't, some were sent forever, but also you could do your term, right? And then you were released. And you could go back to England, or you could stay in Australia, which is how come Australia exists in that sense, in the way it does. But some of them obviously were coming to Shanghai and deciding to have their post-transportation life in Shanghai, ticket of leave. So it was called the ticket of leave, which is still a sort of a phrase in English. And they settled in Shanghai, which is amazing, right? And I'm just like, how can I find the stories of like who these guys were? Sorry. Yes. Who were these guys? What crimes did they commit? How long had they been in Australia? You know, fascinating. Yes, no, go. No, sorry.
Yes. You mentioned lots of interesting stories, some profitable. So how did you go from like writing sort of like history that's for a specific audience to like best-selling books? And you mentioned the trick of taking like true crime or the monarchy and combining with Chinese history, but there's other steps involved, right? Like how, like, did you change your writing, for example? Like, how did you go from, because we are academics, right? We write academic books, so we sell to 10 other people. How did you go from selling to 10 people to a lot of people? Like, what are some of the tricks of the trade?
Yeah, never mentioned the word theory.
Yeah.
Cut down on the footnotes. No, the basic trick is you find the genres where things really work, and then you try and tell history as engagingly and as you want. The really difficult thing for academics, of course, is to dial it down or pull it back, if you like, right? Because you have so much. I mean, I rely really heavily on academics, and I'm very important. It's a very big debate in the UK among literary non-fiction writers like me as to who you credit in your acknowledgements, and I always credit the writers that the academics that I think did very well. And I think of like a book I did, like City of Devils, which was all about Shanghai gangsters. That was really inspired by the work of Frederick Wakeman in America at that time, and also partly by the work of the late great Jonathan Spence and other great sinologists. So I always want to credit them. I'm almost, you know, you're popularizing what they did, right? They wrote it as academics, and they talked about a gangster went in and they did this and they did that. I have them like kicking the door down, gun out, right? That's it, straight to it. Give me all the money, right? You know, and of course that's more fun to read on a 12-hour flight from London to Hong Kong. Right? So yeah, I think that you know, it's literary nonfiction, I think is a way of thinking about it. All the techniques of novel writing, but with all that, I would argue that in my books, particularly Midnight in Peking, City of Devils, they're literary nonfiction because they read like novels, but there's no invented people, no invented places, no invented clues in the murder investigation. Even in City of Devils, and I feel you have a real bond with the reader, when it mentions a telephone number, that telephone number actually existed. I mean, I will sort of go that level. Now, the reader maybe doesn't care, but I think if you do that consistently and you say, I've done this, I think the reader comes to trust you. And hopefully that means they read other things you do. And nothing annoys me more than books that claim to be sort of historical fiction. They can't really call themselves non-fiction, and play around with history. And then the author doesn't say, I've done that. I think it's always very important to say, I have tried to do everything as possible. But if you have done what we would call composite characters, which is I want to talk about everyone here, but I decide to build you into 3 different characters, you should say that you've done it. And if you have invented people, and we do that a lot when we're writing for television or something, to have someone narrate, tell the story, you should just say that you've done it, because you need to have a bond of trust with the reader. And if the reader feels that what they're getting from you is you've not been lazy, you've not just Google booked it, as they say, and nowadays, you know, you haven't chat GPT'd it and all the rest of it, right? Then funnily enough, I was doing an interview with the China Daily yesterday, and that's all they wanted to know about. Are you redundant? Will it all be AI? Is it chat GBT? And you're like, yeah, okay. That's a bizarre conversation. But anyway, that's what you have to do. You know, read novels all the time, which, you know, I'm sure you're reading way too much to find time for novels, but you have to kind of read novels. You know, who was it? Li Hongzhang, the self-strengthening movement, when he went to Japan, he said novels, novels, novels to the Chinese, didn't he? Right? Because no one was writing novels. And that's where you get that whole kind of explosion of Lao Shi, Lu Xun, Bai Jin, and all of that, right? From that self-strengthening movement. Read the novels and then take what you know so well and do it. And I think that it can be done. There are academics out there doing it very successfully. And then there are kind of upstarts like me that have had a sort of a, you know, basic education, who sort of, you know, have tried to sort of punch up, whereas the academics have to sort of learn to punch down a little bit.
Okay, this is great. This is so enjoyable. We can go for hours, especially with your speaking style. We can go for hours. So lovely, lovely. And again, we thank you very much, and thank you for using the resources at our library and the books here that is on sale at a major discount. So please feel free and get an autograph book. Again, thank you so very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you.